What does it actually take to build 7 individuals into a global phenomenon that sells out stadiums on every continent, breaks streaming records that major Western acts couldn't touch, and generates billions in revenue from a country whose music industry the world wasn't even watching a decade ago? That Hybe and its predecessor, Big Hit Entertainment, imposed on BTS from the very beginning. Rules about how they sleep, how they speak, what they're allowed to say publicly and what stays locked behind closed doors, how their bodies are trained, how their minds are managed, and how every single public move is calculated down to the smallest detail. Some of these rules sound harsh, some of them sound impossible, but the results are right there in the numbers and in the history books. This isn't a fan tribute. This is a breakdown of the actual framework behind one of the most disciplined, strategically managed acts in the history of the music industry. Let's get into it.
Number 7. The Trainee Gauntlet. Before a single song was recorded, before a single stage was set, Hybe, then operating as Big Hit Entertainment, put every future BTS member through one of the most demanding trainee systems in the Korean entertainment industry. This wasn't unique to Big Hit alone. The Korean idol trainee system as a concept has existed since the 1990s, pioneered by agencies like SM Entertainment. But what made Big Hit's approach distinct was the context in which it operated. When BTS was being assembled between 2010 and 2013, Big Hit was a small, financially struggling company. They didn't have the resources of SM, YG, or JYP. That financial pressure translated directly into the intensity of how their trainees were developed, because there was no margin for error and no budget for failure. Trainees under Big Hit's system were required to maintain rigorous daily schedules that combined vocal training, dance practice, rap development, language study, and physical conditioning. Members like Jungkook, who joined as a trainee at just 15 years old after turning down offers from multiple larger agencies, trained for years before debut. His decision to follow RM to Big Hit despite the company's small size and uncertain future is now well documented, and what he entered was not a comfortable environment. Trainee life meant hours in practice rooms, evaluations where performance was assessed and roster spots were not guaranteed, and a level of competitive pressure designed to ensure only those with genuine commitment made it to debut. RM himself had been a trainee for approximately 3 years before BTS debuted in June 2013. J-Hope, who came from a background in street dance and had trained under a local dance crew in Gwangju, brought pre-existing technical skill but still underwent the full Big Hit training process to align with the group's developing identity. Suga, who had been producing music independently as an underground rapper in Daegu, entered the system and had to adapt his raw, self-taught style into something that could function within a group framework, a transition that required both technical adjustment and personal discipline. The rule at the core of all of this was simple and non-negotiable. You did not debut until you were ready, and readiness was defined by the company, not by the trainee. This created a baseline standard across all 7 members that was unusually high for a group coming from a mid-tier agency. When BTS debuted, they weren't polished in the way the big 3 agencies polished their acts, but they were tight, versatile, and technically capable across multiple disciplines simultaneously. The long-term effect of this rule is visible in BTS's live performance consistency. Their reputation for high-quality live vocals and synchronized choreography, maintained across world tours covering dozens of countries and thousands of seats, is a direct product of the foundation built during those trainee years. Groups that debut too quickly without sufficient development often struggle to maintain performance standards under the physical demands of a real tour schedule. BTS entered their career already conditioned for exactly that kind of sustained pressure. What a grueling system builds, no shortcut can replicate, and that foundation was only the beginning of what Hybe had planned for them.
Number 6. The no dating policy. It is one of the most debated, most criticized, and most misunderstood rules in the Korean idol industry, and Hybe enforced it on BTS with a consistency that shaped not just their public image, but the entire emotional architecture of how the group connected with their fanbase. The no dating policy, or at minimum, the strict non-disclosure requirement around romantic relationships, is a standard contractual element in Korean idol contracts. It has been legally challenged, publicly scrutinized, and widely condemned by outside observers who view it as an overreach into personal freedom. But understanding why Hybe applied it so rigorously to BTS requires understanding the specific commercial logic behind it and the very particular moment in history when BTS was trying to survive. When BTS debuted in 2013, Big Hit Entertainment was operating under serious financial strain. The company had experienced significant losses in the years prior, and BTS was essentially the agency's last major bet. In that environment, the no dating rule wasn't just about fan sentiment, it was about concentrating every member's public energy entirely on the group's identity, which at that stage was still being built from scratch. A dating scandal in the early years of a struggling group from a small agency had a historically documented pattern of outcome in the Korean industry. It fractured fan bases, dominated media cycles, and pulled narrative control away from the agency entirely. The psychological mechanism behind why this rule drives commercial success is more specific than it might appear. BTS built their fanbase, ARMY, on a foundation of unusually intimate parasocial connection. Through their V-Live broadcasts, their Bangtan bombs behind-the-scenes videos, their personal blog posts on platforms like Weverse, and their lyrics that addressed themes of youth, insecurity, love, and mental health directly, BTS created a relationship with fans that felt personal in a way that was genuinely rare for acts at their scale. The no dating rule, whether intentionally or as a byproduct, preserved a particular emotional availability in how the members presented themselves publicly. Fans felt seen and engaged by them in a space that wasn't complicated by outside romantic visibility. The real-world results of this rule intersecting with that fan relationship model are documented in BTS's commercial trajectory. Their fan-base loyalty translated into album sales figures that broke Korean records repeatedly. Map of the Soul 7, released in February 2020, sold over 4 million copies in its first month, a figure that at the time set a new record for a Korean act. That level of purchase behavior from a fanbase is not passive streaming. It is active, repeated economic participation, and it correlates directly with the depth of fan investment that the group's carefully managed personal image sustained over years. What makes Hybe's application of this rule particularly notable is how it evolved rather than simply persisted. As BTS grew into a global act with undeniable leverage, the enforcement of complete non-disclosure became less absolute. Members began acknowledging relationships, some confirmed publicly, some addressed indirectly, and the fanbase, by that point mature and deeply rooted, absorbed those developments without the catastrophic commercial fallout that the rule had been originally designed to prevent. The policy had done its structural work during the years that mattered most. The rule that once felt like a cage had, by the time it loosened, already built something strong enough to stand without it.
Number 5. The mandatory military conscription compliance, BTS. There are very few moments in the career of a global music act where a government law directly dictates the operational future of the group. And for BTS, that moment arrived publicly and unavoidably in the form of South Korea's mandatory military conscription requirement. Every able-bodied South Korean male is legally required to serve approximately 18 to 21 months in the military, typically before the age of 28 to 30. There are no permanent exemptions for entertainers, regardless of commercial achievement or cultural influence. This is not a rule Hybe invented. It is a constitutional obligation enforced by the South Korean government. but how Hybe chose to navigate it, manage it, and ultimately frame it as a non-negotiable commitment rather than a crisis became one of the most strategically significant decisions in the group's entire history. The debate around BTS and military service stretched across several years and became a genuine national conversation in South Korea. There was a real legislative question on the table. South Korean law already grants military exemptions to classical musicians and athletes who achieve specific internationally recognized honors on the basis that their work constitutes cultural service to the nation. BTS's supporters and some politicians argued that BTS's contribution to South Korean soft power, their role in driving tourism, their cultural export value estimated by the Hyundai Research Institute at billions of dollars annually in economic impact, justified similar consideration. The debate went all the way to the National Assembly. Hybe's response to this pressure was careful and deliberate. Rather than lobbying aggressively for exemption in a way that could generate public resentment inside South Korea, where the mandatory service requirement carries deep cultural and political weight, and where perceived preferential treatment for wealthy entertainers is historically unpopular, the company and the members themselves consistently stated publicly that they would fulfill their obligations. Jin, the oldest member, was the first to enlist, entering the military in December 2022. The others followed on a staggered schedule designed to minimize the period during which the full group would be unavailable simultaneously. What makes this a rule worth examining in the context of BTS's success is the reputational consequence of the compliance decision itself. In South Korea, public figures who are perceived to have evaded or manipulated the conscription system face career-ending backlash. There are well-documented cases of actors and entertainers whose popularity collapsed entirely following conscription controversies. By contrast, BTS's transparent and orderly enlistment process generated a measurable wave of positive domestic sentiment. Their standing inside South Korea, which had occasionally been complicated by their overwhelming international identity, was significantly reinforced by the straightforward way they handled a requirement that ordinary Korean men face without the option of debate. Internationally, the enlistment was framed not as a disruption, but as a pause, and Hybe's management of that framing was precise. Solo projects for individual members were greenlit and supported during the service period, keeping each member's artistic identity active and visible without requiring the full group. This approach maintained commercial momentum across a gap that could have caused significant market erosion if mishandled. The decision to comply fully, communicate clearly, and plan structurally around an unavoidable legal reality, rather than fight it, turned a potential vulnerability into a demonstration of exactly the kind of integrity that long-term institutional credibility is built on. Number 4. The controlled social media protocol. In an era where social media spontaneity is treated as the gold standard of authentic celebrity branding, Hybe built and enforced a social media framework around BTS that operated on almost the opposite principle, and the commercial results it produced made it one of the most studied fan engagement models in the modern music industry. This was not a simple content calendar or a basic PR filter. It was a structured, multi-platform ecosystem with specific rules about what got shared, when, how often, and through which channels. And it was designed from the ground up to maximize the depth of fan connection rather than just the volume of impressions. The foundation of this system was the deliberate separation of platforms by function. Twitter, or X as it is now known, was used primarily for broad announcements, milestone acknowledgements, and real-time event engagement, the layer of communication visible to the general public and casual followers. YouTube carried the official music content, music videos, and the Bangtan Bomb series, which offered behind-the-scenes footage edited and released on a controlled schedule. But the most strategically significant platform in BTS's social media architecture was VLive, a South Korean live streaming service, and later Weverse, a fan community platform that Hybe itself developed and owns. Weverse is where the protocol becomes genuinely interesting from a business standpoint. Hybe launched Weverse in 2019 as a proprietary platform designed to consolidate fan interaction within an ecosystem the company directly controlled. Rather than building a fan base on Instagram or Twitter, platforms owned by third parties, subject to algorithm changes and generating advertising revenue for other companies, Hybe invested in creating the infrastructure itself. BTS members posted personal updates, handwritten notes, candid photos, and direct replies to fan comments on Weverse in a way that felt intimate and unfiltered, while still operating within a framework the company could monitor and manage. The platform generated its own revenue through paid membership tiers and merchandise integration. The rules governing what BTS members communicated publicly were not simply about avoiding controversy. They were about maintaining a specific information economy. Fans who engaged consistently with BTS content across Weverse, VLive, and YouTube received a volume and intimacy of access that was genuinely unusual for acts at BTS's commercial scale. Most artists at stadium selling level become progressively less accessible as their fame grows. The opposite happened with BTS, because Hybe's protocol was specifically engineered to sustain and even increase the sensation of personal connection as the group's audience expanded globally. The measurable outcome of this system is visible in BTS's streaming and album sales behavior. Their fan base didn't just listen. They organized coordinated streaming parties, purchased multiple album versions, and drove chart performance with a level of structural discipline that casual fan bases don't produce. That behavior is a direct product of a community that had been cultivated through years of consistent, protocol-governed engagement that made fans feel like genuine participants in the group's journey, rather than passive consumers of content. The irony of Hybe's social media protocol is that by controlling the framework so carefully, they created something that felt more real than the unfiltered chaos most celebrities mistake for authenticity. Number 3. The artistic ownership rule. There is a specific moment in BTS's history that separates them structurally from almost every other idol group that came before them, and it happened not on a stage or in a music video, but in a negotiation room, when Big Hit Entertainment made the decision to give BTS members meaningful creative participation in their own music. This was not standard practice in the Korean idol industry. The conventional model, refined across decades by the major agencies, operated on a clear division of labor. The company wrote the music, designed the concepts, and delivered a finished artistic product to the group for execution. The idol's job was performance, not authorship. Hybe broke from that model with BTS in a way that had direct, documentable consequences for the quality, authenticity, and commercial longevity of what the group produced. The clearest evidence of this rule in practice is the writing and production credits on BTS's discography. Suga, who releases solo music under the name August D and produces under the name Suga, has production and writing credits across a substantial portion of BTS's catalog going back to their earliest albums. RM, who was already writing rap lyrics independently before debut, has co-writing credits that span the group's entire career. J-Hope has co-written and co-produced tracks across multiple BTS projects while simultaneously developing a solo discography that reflects a genuinely distinct artistic identity. Even members whose primary roles are vocal rather than production, like Jin, Jimin, V, and Jungkook, have accumulated songwriting credits over the course of the group's career, with these solo work in particular demonstrating a compositional sensibility that developed visibly over time. What Hybe implemented was not simply permission to contribute, it was a structured environment in which contribution was expected, supported, and integrated into the group's official output. Big Hit's in-house production team, which included producer and company founder Bang Si-hyuk, worked alongside the members rather than simply delivering completed material to them. This collaborative model meant that when BTS sang about personal experiences, youth anxiety, social pressure, mental health, the cost of ambition, those themes weren't constructed by external writers guessing at what would resonate. They came from the people living them, filtered through a professional production framework that refined raw personal material into commercially viable music without stripping out its emotional specificity. The commercial consequence of this approach is visible in the group's album concept depth. The Wings album, released in 2016, incorporated literary references to Hermann Hesse's novel Demian, alongside visually and thematically connected short films for each member, a level of conceptual ambition that required genuine intellectual investment from the people executing it, not just performance compliance. The Love Yourself series, which ran across 3 albums between 2017 and 2018 and generated some of BTS's highest sales figures, was built around a philosophical framework about self-acceptance that RM addressed directly in his 2018 speech at the United Nations General Assembly, a speech he wrote himself, delivered in Korean to a global audience without a ghostwriter. That United Nations moment was not a marketing stunt dropped into a vacuum. It was the logical public expression of an artistic identity that had been built through years of genuine creative ownership that Hybe's goals made structurally possible from the very beginning.
Number 2, the physical and mental health maintenance protocol. The Korean idol industry has a documented and serious problem with performer health. The training and performance demands placed on idol group members have produced a consistent pattern of stress injuries, vocal damage, extreme weight management pressure, and mental health crises that have affected acts across every major agency. The industry's historical response to these issues was, for a long time, largely one of suppression. Keep performing, keep the schedule, manage the optics, deal with the consequences later. Hybe's approach to BTS's physical and mental health was different, and the difference wasn't purely humanitarian. It was strategic, measurable, and directly connected to the group's ability to sustain a career at the highest level across more than a decade. The physical demands placed on BTS are not abstract. Their concert productions, particularly the Love Yourself World Tour in 2018 and 2019, and the Map of the Soul Tour that was ultimately restructured due to the COVID pandemic, were designed at a scale and technical complexity that placed extreme physical requirements on every member simultaneously. A standard BTS concert set runs over 2 hours, involves intricate synchronized choreography across a large stage, and requires vocal performance at a level that most acts pre-record or heavily supplement with backing tracks. BTS's live vocal standard, maintained consistently across long tour legs, is only physiologically possible if the performers are being managed carefully between shows, with adequate recovery time, physiotherapy access, and monitored physical conditioning. Hybe invested in professional sports-level physical support infrastructure for BTS in a way that was not standard for Korean idol groups. This included dedicated physical trainers, scheduled recovery protocols between tour dates, and medical support staff integrated into tour operations. The evidence of this investment is visible in the injury record, or more precisely, the relative absence of career-threatening physical breakdowns across 7 members over a decade of some of the most demanding performance schedules in the music industry.
There have been injuries. Suga underwent shoulder surgery in 2020 for a condition he had been managing since before debut, a left shoulder injury originally sustained during his pre-debut years working a part-time delivery job. But the overall physical continuity of the group across their active years reflects a management approach that treated performer health as a long-term asset rather than a short-term variable. The mental health dimension of this protocol is where Hybe's approach became genuinely ahead of industry norms. In 2019 and 2020, multiple BTS members spoke publicly and in documented interviews about experiences with anxiety, depression, and the psychological weight of sustained global fame at a young age. RM, Suga, and other members addressed these experiences not in the vague, carefully distanced language that Korean entertainment culture typically uses around mental health, but with a directness that broke from industry convention. Suga's mixtape, released under the name August D in 2016, contained tracks addressing depression and social phobia with clinical specificity that was almost entirely without precedent in Korean idol music. Hybe's decision to permit and, in some cases, actively support this level of public honesty about mental health was itself a rule. A rule that said the members' psychological reality was not something to be hidden from the audience, because the audience was the very demographic most likely to be experiencing the same things. That decision deepened the group's connection with their fanbase in a way that no marketing campaign could manufacture, while simultaneously creating an internal culture where mental health was treated as a legitimate operational concern rather than a professional weakness. The result was a group that didn't burn out on schedule, because the system was built to prevent exactly that.
Number 1. The global localization strategy. If there is one rule in Hybe's operational framework that sits above all others in terms of its structural impact on BTS's trajectory, from a mid-tier Korean idol group to the best-selling music act in South Korean history, it is this: never assume the domestic market is the ceiling, and build every system from the beginning as if the entire world is the target audience. This sounds like a simple philosophy statement. In practice, it was a specific, resource-intensive, multi-year operational commitment that required Hybe to make decisions that were expensive, unconventional, and at the time genuinely uncertain in outcome, long before there was any evidence they would work. The localization strategy began with language. RM's fluency in English, which he developed largely through self-directed study using American television as a learning tool, became a structural asset that Hybe recognized early and deployed deliberately. In international interviews, press appearances, and eventually in the group's direct communication with global fans, RM functioned as a primary bridge, not because the other members were discouraged from learning or using other languages, but because having a native-level communicator at the front of the group's international presence meant that BTS could engage with non-Korean media on equal intellectual footing rather than through the filtered, simplified register that translation dependency often forces. Other members developed functional English over time, and the group's Japanese proficiency, maintained through dedicated language study as part of their Hybe training protocol, supported one of the most successful Japanese market penetrations any Korean act has achieved, with Japanese releases receiving dedicated production rather than simple translation of Korean material. But language was only the surface layer of the localization strategy. The deeper rule was about cultural accessibility without cultural compromise. Hybe made the decision that BTS would not soften, westernize, or dilute their Korean identity to gain international traction, a decision that ran counter to the conventional wisdom of the time, which assumed that Asian acts needed to produce English-language content or collaborate heavily with Western artists to break through in American and European markets.
BTS's early international growth was built almost entirely on Korean language music, and Hybe supported that approach by investing in international distribution infrastructure, global streaming platform relationships, and a social media strategy specifically designed to reach non-Korean audiences without requiring them to encounter BTS through a Western cultural intermediary first. The Billboard strategy is where this rule produced its most visible and historically significant results. Hybe and their U.S. partner Columbia Records worked systematically on understanding the specific mechanics of Billboard chart eligibility, streaming thresholds, sales tracking, radio play requirements, and built fan engagement campaigns around ARMY that educated the fan base on how to maximize chart impact through legal, coordinated participation. DNA entered the Billboard 100 in 2017, making BTS the first Korean act to chart there with a Korean-language song. Fake Love followed in 2018. Dynamite, their first English-language single released in 2020, debuted at number 1, but by that point the infrastructure for that achievement had been under construction for years. The 2020 United Nations appearance, the Time magazine covers, the Grammy nominations, the White House meeting in 2022, where the members spoke directly with President Biden about anti-Asian hate crimes, none of these happened because BTS accidentally became internationally visible. They happened because Hybe built a global localization system precise enough to place a Korean group from a small Seoul agency into every significant cultural institution in the world, one deliberate, methodical step at a time. The most powerful rule Hybe ever enforced wasn't about what BTS couldn't do. It was about refusing to accept any boundary on what they could.